Hi, this is Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. This video is going to be part 3 of my 10k scoop PLO MTT hand history review. Hopefully everyone's enjoying the series so far because the plan for this video is more of the same. End of last part, we just doubled up Flat Cat to our immediate right, so he's now back up to nearly a starting stack. We're still well within the re-entry period, I should imagine, given current big blind. And we're just going to dive straight into the action. Standard open in the cutoff, I think, with a suited Broadway ace. Damn few peels bottom, which is not our ideal scenario. On the flop, I think we might get a few c-bets. If we were somehow compelled or decided to simplify to pure check, I don't think we'd suffer, monumental EV loss. But if we did have c-bets, then they'd probably be combinations with a much more polar equity distribution. Our hand just going to pure check with, a bad straight draw and some kind of semi-tainted two-pair outs and stuff like that. And then call most reasonably sized IP stabs. Obviously, if damn few bets like 4-pot, we can just fold. On the turn, I think OOP is reasonably incentivized to bet top 2 and hands of similar strength. Obviously, you want to bet some has like Queen 9 because IP is going to have quite a lot of hands that we pretty much only ever get money in good against on turn, but we get a bet in pretty good against that subset of hands like Ace, King, 10, 9 and Kings with clubs and some worse 2-pair. So I think we're going to have relatively high aggression with top 2-pair specifically. Generally, from the sims I've looked at, the idea seems to be, few surprises, they're not really worth going through. But we just generally do more betting, get more aggression when we either block the nuts, so we have like Queen, Jack, 9, Queen, 10, 9, or we have added equity like King, Queen, 10, 9 with a nut gut shot, or Queen 9 with clubs, and that kind of thing. Even like Ace, Queen 9, so you can value bet a couple extra rivers when you hit your overcard. So we're going to be betting those hands at a higher frequency and then checking our drier Queen 9 combinations. Like, if you bet and he calls, and your plan is to then basically check like 99% of rivers, then that's a Queen 9 combination that you probably shouldn't be betting in the first place. You should use it to kind of bolster your checking range and prevent Dan Few from getting to delay stab super often or super merged or super whatever. So we go with delay c-bet. I can easily live with simplifying to, pure bet the Queen Jack 10, Queen 10, 9, Queen 9 of clubs, and then pure check the other combinations, especially given that like when I have Queen 9 and I open cutoff, I very often have a 10 or a Jack or 2 clubs in my hand. So that probably gets me to around about the right frequency. This might be a little bit lazy, although it's not going to be like that far off the mark. Get hit with IP raise. From what I remember, Queen 9 is meant to be a pure continue versus IP raise because it's just too far up in your range in terms of current showdown value. And it's also partially a product of the type of combinations we're choosing to bet with in the first place, because you can have trivial calls with Queen 9 with clubs or calls with something like Queen 10, 9 that has a straight draw and straight blocker, like that kind of thing. But even those hands, with the exception of Queen 9 with clubs, like even Queen 10, 9, Queen Jack 9, aren't going to be doing fantastically against a well-constructed IP strategy. I'd imagine they're relatively close to 0 EV. And hands like this are going to be pretty low EV continues, especially against someone like Dan Few, who is going to have the right kind of bluffs at the right kind of frequency and follow through the right amount on the right rivers and so on and so forth. So I kind of like just folding now, which is potentially an argument for not betting in the first place. It seems a little bit lazy to delay c-bet this combination, but we get punished. Standard defend, obviously, and versus third pot with a wrap and a pair and a straight flush blocker. Very easy call. Turn checks through. TJ bets like a relatively normal size once the action on flop and turn is unfolded in the way that it did. I think river is kind of close for me. On the one hand, I have a pretty decent bluff catcher, like a mid club, which blocks some of his like bet check bet flushes, and then 2-pair, which makes it so he has more potential like worse than 2-pair hands to bluff, and then a straight, which can obviously just win at showdown. There are a couple of things, though. First is that I think this is a situation where it matters quite a lot what position the imposition player opened from. Like, if he opens button, I think I'm just stuck calling, because he's pretty wide pre-flop, so I defend wide, which means that he c-bets and I defend a little bit wider on the flop. And this hand just gets to be too high in my range. Whereas once I check call flop, I think I basically always have like a pair and a straight draw or 2 pair plus. And that can then mean that even if this hand is like highish in my range, I can end up with hands that make better bluff catchers, even though they may have lower absolute showdown value. Like, for example, the King of Clubs, Queen 10-9, I think I'd rather call than this hand. Queen of Clubs, Jack 10-9, same kind of thing. Oh, or Queen, Jack of Clubs, 10-9, like that. I think I'd rather call those hands. So this seems like a hand that maybe has to call, but probably shouldn't be feeling too good about it. The other thing is that, I mean, it's a small factor, and it would only sway me in kind of close decisions, but bet, check, bet just isn't a super commonly bluffed line for the imposition player. Like, that's going to have a lot less weight when you're dealing with someone like TJ, who last made a mistake back in the 19th century. But it's just, there are lines that get bluffed more often and lines that get bluffed less often. And if you get your hands on a large enough sample of hands, then you can figure out what those lines are. And an IP bet, check, bet just happens to be a line that I know is a relatively, has a higher than average percentage of value bets, basically. So, yeah, the fact that I'm not sure I want to call completely linearly, the fact that I can maybe have some river check raises, like I can check some flushes, obviously, although I need to call wider than flushes. But the fact that I'm not sure I want to call linearly, the fact that the line gets kind of underbluffed, and just to be honest, the fact that I kind of just instinctively believe this bet makes me think that I should be folding. But we go with call and run into a hand that makes a ton of sense. And to be honest, TJ and I have a tradition when we play together where we contest pots periodically and he wins invariably. And I think traditions are pretty important, so I'm glad I continue to observe that particular one. Skierboy open limps cutoff off about 50 big blinds. This isn't exactly bad, but it's not something I personally would choose to do. I don't like open limping cutoff because it almost guarantees that this is going to happen. Like, Button's going to VPip in some way, shape, or form, and then you're going to be out of position to him for, however long he remains in the pot. Whereas if you open and Button doesn't VPip, then you have absolute position guarantee for the rest of the hand. I also think that you're going to want to play pretty tight in the cutoff off 50 big blinds. So it's not like open limping makes it so that you get to include like VPip at a much higher frequency. And it's also not like the lineup behind is absurdly soft such that he decides, well, I just want to get in as many pots as possible kind of thing. So I personally would not have this strategy, but I'm sure it's fine as long as it's properly balanced. Speaking of being properly, but like if he constructs his limping range the same way solvers do, then this is pure limp call. Never limp re-raises, never limp folds. Versus one ISO, obviously. Like if action explodes behind him, he can do what he wants. Three-way to the flop. Unblocking nutted stuff is pretty bad multi-way. Like it obviously it's never great, but it gets significantly worse the more players are in the pot. Because like card removal just becomes more of a thing. Like because I don't have any queens or tens, Skierboy has queen 10 plus more often. And if Skierboy doesn't have queen 10 plus, then that means he doesn't have these cards. So Flat Cat has them even more often, and so on and so forth. Kings block some high equity continues, but Kings can just check call and stuff. So yeah, I kind of like just checking. We go with bet, which I was semi-afraid of. It's not that bad, I guess, is my starting point. Like, this isn't... There are some get-ins that one of them can have, like ace, queen, jack, 8, that I do quite well against. I can just get 2 folds. I can make Skierboy fold a hand like a 10, which is worth something to me. And And if we change the particulars of the situation slightly, then I could even, I can get behind betting. But I think the main reason I want to check is that I have pretty good options when I check. Firstly, I can check fold versus bet raise, rather than, wasting these. Like, if these guys both have, the top third of their range, let's say, action's going to go bet raise quite often. And that's going to happen a little bit more often when I don't block any of the pairs. And when, both of these players, it's quite easy to interact with Queen 10x. Those are cards that are very well represented in ranges that VPIP. And so it's nice to just not lose this 6 or 7 big blinds, the whatever percent of the time that happens. It's going to be like, 15, 20% or something that sequence is going to occur. And I'm just automatically going to lose, that many big blinds 15, 20% of the time. And it seems like in a close spot that could easily swing it from one decision to the other. I can also, if it goes check and then flat cat stabs, I can check shove maybe. I can even maybe check shove versus Skierboy. I can definitely check call versus one bet from anyone. So yeah, given that I have reasonable playability if I check, I think checking is going to be the better play. If for some reason my options were a lot more limited if I checked, then it's close enough that I think betting is not it's not out of the realms of possibility that betting could be the best option if you tweak the scenario slightly. But kind of seems like this just sets the hand up to play pretty trickily. I get flatted and the turn is, anything other than a king or a jack or the deuce of diamonds, and I'm in a not fantastic spot. But we get 2 folds, so woohoo for us. Pretty clear call. I probably do have leads on this texture, although maybe not against under the gun on this dryer board. Anyway, this hand's never leading. Definitely has quite a lot of interest in probing turn, though. IP's going to continue a whole bunch, but he folds sometimes, and I can just start applying pressure to, certain elements of his range immediately. And it's kind of the opposite of the other situation, where if I check and he bombs it, I'm in a pretty nasty spot then, so. Probing is at least reasonable, and my options once I check aren't great, so we'll go with probe. Obviously river check. Damn few bets half pot, and so I'm fairly sure that this has to be an equilibrium call because I unblock all the straight draws, and I'm relatively high in my range on this kind of run out, given that I'm probing quite a lot of draws myself. Instinctively, it doesn't feel like a bluff, but as with TJ, you can have that thought, and it's risky to make significant deviations on limited info based against quality opposition. It's not like damn few struggles to find natural bluffs, so I would imagine I need to be, without good cause, I need to be pretty close to equilibrium here, and so I just end up flicking it in. In game, I fold, which is definitely a theoretical mistake. It may have been an okay in-game situation. It's possible, knowing myself, that this hand against Danfu and the hand against TJ were both relatively similar in that the in-position player made a river bet that didn't really feel instinctively to me was a bluff. When I saw it in the review both times, both hands, it kind of felt like value both times. And I'd imagine maybe I had a similar feeling in game. And so potentially because I kind of ignored it and called and lost against TJ, I just decided to listen to inner self this time against Danfu. But the problem is that, I have very limited information on, I have no information that I can articulate that would cause me to, that would make an exploit of this magnitude justifiable, basically. Danfu, even if he's slightly underbluffing, I think my hand still has to call. I think the call option is robust, even against slightly exploitable strategies. He has to be making a significant deviation, never bluffing this spot, or never bluffing against me specifically, before I kind of get to stop calling my hand. So I was probably just trying to be a bit too clever in a spot where that's not going to work out very well for me in the long term. But yeah, like any ace X is start calling against half pot here, given like the multitude of potential bluffs damn few can have. Not going to be a thing to flat many unpaired tri-suited hands, especially one this week, and especially versus MP Open. So a little bit all over the place in the last 5-10 minutes of game time. Oh well. Seem to have capped the damage at the cost of the original Open. So skill by Open's cut off 40 big blinds. It probably makes sense to have full pot as a sizing if he has limps as well. Like, I've never really understood a strategy that has as its two kind of strategic prongs, limp and like 2.2x. They just seem way too close together. So I'm not sure I like limping, but if he is limping, then 3.5x should probably be his raise size. We have a super easy 3-bet and get in. Yeah, our hand plays awfully against his 4-betting range, but we're just stuck getting the money in and hoping now, I think. He can have like ace, queen, queen, 10 double suited and whatever that we do okay against. Instead, he has double suited aces, and we draw out. Standard hand here. The only thing I'd say is that it's worth keeping an eye. If you run a HUD while you're playing PLO tournaments, which is a little bit risky because of the nature of the situations that will get recorded in the sample sizes for each stat. You know, like someone has 100% PFR over 50 hands, and then it turns out just because they were the chip leader during a bubble that lasted for a particularly long time, stuff like that can easily skew your data. But one stat that it probably is worth keeping an eye on is fold versus 3-bet in and out of position, because that assumes kind of more relevance in a tournament environment than in a cash game environment. And there are people who are just like super disinclined to call 3-bets when the 3-better is in position. And you probably get to pound on those people a little bit more. Very easy to defend. Can lead flop here. If I had like ace-5 of hearts and then like the 8 of spades or something, I'd probably lead. I'm blocking all the flush draws. I think check and then check call is pretty reasonable. And I kind of like checking again, although I have a wrap and check call isn't a fantastic option. I just feel like a cutoff range interacts with this board really well, especially when I unblock like every single draw, other than specifically the wheel wrap, which is a draw he won't have super often. He will have, Queen X of spades or King, Queen, Jack, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think most of my EV is actually in the check through. I think probing against button is fine. I think checking is probably the play against earlier positions. And then pretty easy call. Like I just don't have fantastic. Well, I don't have fantastic bluff prospects. I guess like I could probe turn and then follow through on certain rivers, given the IP can have like spade draws and stuff, but there aren't many bricks. And so I don't think that has particularly broad applicability. Like I might get to bluff as like a 7 or something like that, and 7 or an 8, and that's about it. So yeah, we go check call, which seems fine, and obviously check fold now. Folds to us, blind versus blind. I think this is a decent hand to limp with. Definitely don't want to be opening. Too strong to fold, so kind of, if nothing else, and by process of elimination, we're left with limp. And we go with fold versus ISO, which I think is fine. Something that I've, in a weird way, kind of struggled with, I guess, just because the spot doesn't often matter enough in terms of pot size to justify spending a lot of time, is finding the right hands to limp fold with in this spot. And obviously that does matter a little bit more when you're in an environment like this, with zero rake and such, where playing a wider range from the small blind is going to be more incentivized, and so you're going to end up with more kind of marginal candidates that you end up V-pipping and having to figure out what to do with. So you can take a quick look at preflop sim, and set it up so that we get ISO'd. As you see, we raised, we fold 20% of the time. creating kind of a similar grouping of hands to the one I ended up with. We can see that these hands fold nearly half the time. So these are unpaired single-suited hands with no ace. Unpaired single-suited hands with no ace. I think that these hands are just so easily dominated by the value region of IP's ISOs. King, Queen, Jack, 9 kind of crushes a hand like Queen, 10, 7, 5. Worth talking about a couple of hands that limp fold at a higher or lower frequency. First thing is pairs seem to basically never limp fold. Double suited hands, obviously, kind of obvious. Basically never limp folding. Interesting one to me was tri-suited hands actually do quite a bit of calling, and I think that's because we weed out the weaker combinations first time around. Like if our hand is tri-suited, we're a little bit less inclined to VPip it in the first place, and so the combinations that do make the cut kind of are often strong enough that they can actually continue to contest the pot even versus ISO. Like we can see over here, these hands are just like a lot more coordinated and high pair heavy than some of the kind of Queen 10 7 5, King Jack 8 4 single suiteds that we were limp folding. Another interesting thing is something like a deuce, which very rarely seems to fold. I think that's kind of an extension of the same reason. Like we're not VPipping all that many deuces, and so if we have a deuce and we VPip it, then it's almost like that's an acknowledgement that our hand is strong enough to continue versus ISO, because the other three cards obviously have to be pretty good to make up for the fact that we're stuck kind of carrying a deuce dangler around quite a lot of the time. So yeah, the unpaired hands, like pairs, we established do very little folding, so the unpaired hands do more, and then nut suits never fold, so non-nut suits do more folding, and then no ace at all, single suited hands. These seem to be the ones that we're finding kind of the bulk of our folds from, because this is a region that we have 20% of the time, so we have it quite often, and we're folding it nearly half the time. So this is like 10% of our fold frequency, and our fold frequency is only 20%. So I thought that was worth pointing out for people who are kind of struggling to implement limping from the small blind into their game. Standard open here. And we can, I guess, check this hand back. Like it has, it can defend okay against probes and such like that. But I think we have so many stacked blockers and kind of positive attributes that our hand's just going to be a super high frequency c-bet. We have a spade, so we block flush draws. We have a 5, we block straight and combo draws. Top pair, so we get check raised, layer spacked, or flush draw, so we can barrel more, like those kinds of things. So just pretty much always betting, I think. Small blind limps, super standard ISO at this and pretty much every other stack size. On the flop, I think this is a situation where we suffer from the SPR being decreased. Firstly, I mean, that's a relatively solid general guideline when you're the in-position player. Your opportunities to leverage positional advantage are correlated to the number of streets that betting is likely to continue across. Secondly, though, the thing is here that out of position gets to check raise significantly wider at shallower SPR. Like out of position can just check raise every ace-5 combination here, whereas at SPR 12 or whatever it will be at 100 big blinds, those hands are playing extremely, well, not extremely, but considerably more passively. And our hand loses a lot of EV when it gets check raised. It's kind of unclear to me whether we get to get this in, but we definitely lose a ton of EV versus check raise. And so unblocking a lot of combinations that are going to go for that check raise and being in a situation whose nature and characteristics make it so that out of position can check raise wider anyway, kind of inclines me towards checking back here when the EV of checking back is reasonably high. You have to be kind of careful on ace high balls, just because if we're saying that out of position gets to check raise wider and wider, then unlike the top pair card being so well represented in both our ranges, creates kind of removal effects where if we both have a disproportionate amount of ace-x going into the flop, and then I have 4 cards, none of which are an ace, then out of position starts to have quite a bit of ace-x. And the fact that it will check raise a decent number of those combinations just kind of makes checking feel significantly more appealing than the betting and kind of praying not to get piled on. So yeah, I would assume that we don't do much c-betting here, or at least that the EV of c-betting, like there's no way that EV of c-betting is much higher than the EV of checking, and I can easily see it being lower. So we go with check, and this seems like a super standard small bet spot. There are a few properties of the small bet that is worth briefly going into, because if I were to be asked why I would like, the first thing is the static nature of the texture. But the second thing that pops into my mind is that this sizing compels out of position to defend wider than ace X. And then something that occurs to me very soon thereafter is it would be a reasonable question for someone to ask why that has value to us. Like, if we let him defend a wider and wider range, doesn't that mean that we get to bluff less and less? And if we size down, doesn't that mean that we need a more value-centric range that kind of caps our bluff frequency pretty heavily? And so there are a few reasons why I think small bet is going to be the heavily preferred option here. And we're just going to dig into those briefly in the solver. So the first is that out of position doesn't do much betting on this turn, so his range doesn't get all that, his range isn't significantly affected once he checks, because I should expect him to check the vast majority of the time. The second is that, following on from the ace being well represented in both our ranges, we can still expect out of position to have ace X here, or ace X plus here reasonably frequently. If we just say how often do you have better than an ace, he ends up with better than an ace, 40% of the time, which seems kind of insane. And if you made it, for example, queen 6-5 queen, there's no way he would have queen X plus 40% of the time. It's a property unique to the ace being such a commonly V-pipped card. And so if he has decently strong hands at quite a high frequency and he's checking the majority of his range, then the first reason that out of position, or in position rather, is going to prefer the small sizing is just that when we have a one street bluff, we lose less when he checks a hand that has an easy continue. You can see a bunch of hands that are probably going to be one and done here, and it's nice for those hands to lose less against his ace X plus when he has ace X plus so frequently. The second reason is that it's rarely going to work out too well for you if you take a line that gives your opponent a very obvious and easy to execute response strategy. And as we start sizing bigger and bigger and bigger, out of position is going to have to find fewer and fewer defends with hands weaker than ace X. If we just kind of take a look at that section of his range. So he has to defend a third of them, and that's a third of 60%. So it's like 20% of hands against third pot. And as we take the sizing up, he just starts to be able to fold more and more and more of them until versus full pot, he's essentially pure folding everything worse than an ace with a sprinkling of kings with a king in clubs, queens with a queen in clubs, that kind of thing. And so he has essentially an automatic decision against full pot. It's do I have an ace or a flush? No. I fold, do I? Yes, okay, I'm going to continue in some way. And therefore we give him basically no room to make a mistake. If we pick a sizing such as third pot, where he suddenly has to defend, some Broadway pairs and maybe even some slightly weaker hands, 9-8-6, maybe that kind of thing, we give him we increase the potential for him to make an error, basically. Yeah, some combinations of 9-8-6 without better than an ace are going to have to continue here. And he's going to miss the odd one of these. And similar hands as well. And basically then we give him, we put him in a situation where he's going to make a mistake at a higher frequency, which is going to be good for us. The final reason that occurs to me is that keeping his range wider and having it include more of those type of hands is going to mean good things for our two-barrel prospects. So sometimes we're going to have a hand we're one and done on the turn. Sometimes we're going to have a hand we want to follow through with at quite a high frequency. And if we bet full pot on the turn and he just continues every ace plus and nothing weaker, then barreling through on a bunch of rivers is going to be kind of treacherous waters for us with a lot of potential bluff candidates, because we're bluffing into such a strong range. Whereas if we pick a small sizing on turn and he has all of these, pocket tens and 9-7-6 and that kind of stuff, the chances that we get a river bluff through are significantly increased because he has more hands that are just more or less auto-folding. It is interesting to me, having said all that we do get a little bit of small bet, a large bet, or a small bit of large bet, and it seems to have a very clearly defined objective, which is to target the Broadway pair hand class. Because as we see here, if we have, let's say, better than tens, not better than an ace, This is a hand class that's more or less pure continuing against third pot and more or less pure folding against full pot. And so what we do is we pack this range in large part with a bunch of hands that retain equity against the weaker elements of his calling range, but they also unblock the combinations we're trying to generate additional folds from. And so these will be combinations like 7-7-6-5, goes for the big bet at a pretty high frequency. 8-7-7-6, quite a bit of interest in betting big. And then even combinations, assuming they don't c-bet flop, of course, like 4-4-3-3. So basically a lot of small cards that interact in some way with the board but don't have significant showdown value are going to go for the big bet at some frequency. But our hand, the king of clubs, without better than a full house, is going to mix a reasonable amount of check, which is a little bit of a surprise to me, in Solverland at least, but when it bets, is going to somewhat heavily prefer the small sizing, and that's the option we went with. Get called, essentially a brick river, and super easy value bet now. I'd imagine we're betting down to about the 10 high flush, maybe a pip wider, maybe a pip tighter, but every combination of the king high flush is going to be a slam dunk value bet. Go with what looks like 2/3 pot or a little bit under, and we get piled on. This isn't a particularly fun situation, at the risk of stating the profoundly obvious, not only because we have a bluff catcher with mediocre removal, but also because our line is somewhat incongruent with having better hands. Like, we bet a lot of our ace-6 and some of our ace-5 on flop. We don't bet all of our ace-x on turn, so we don't have all that much ace-3 by the time. Like, when we go check bet and the river is a 3, ace-3 isn't a well-represented combination in our range. Equally, there are some good things going on. The first is his risk-reward means that we don't need to defend a ton of our value range in order to be defending appropriately. Like, he's risked about 48 to win just over 30, so I should be defending just under 40% of my value bets. And a point I thought might be worth making is that when your opponent has as polarized a range as someone typically does when they check raise river, you don't react to that polarity with linearity of your own. It's quite an easy line of thought, and I've seen it written in forum posts and said by some people and so on and so forth, like, well, I got in this spot and then I just decided to defend the top such and such percentage of my range, or I was high in my range, so I continued. And that doesn't really have any merit in this situation. When your opponent is super polar, then you're going to value removal effects over where you are in your range. What I mean, kind of zoomed into this precise hand, is that any flush that has no pair blockers is going to make a much worse bluff catcher than any flush that has one or more pair blockers, irrespective of the ranks of those two flushes. So I would way rather have, the worst flush imaginable with a 6 than this combination to be bluff catching. Although the solver opts for a larger river bet size, I can't exactly remember why I went with the one that I didn't, I suppose. It doesn't really matter because the same kind of concepts apply. When he gets shoved on, then if, say, he has worse than pocket 3s with a flush, then he's calling roughly half of them. But if we say, okay, now you have a pair blocker, now he's calling all of them, virtually all of them in the case of the 3 and all of them with the 6 and the 5. If we take out the pair blockers, they essentially pure fold. So we're left with a situation where the solver is basing the decision on whether to call or fold with their bluff catchers solely on the presence or absence of pair blockers. And that makes for kind of a simple way to deal with what might be potentially somewhat of a confusing situation. Like, out of position can be turning some ace-x into a bluff here, obviously, but it's important to keep in mind that your response to that isn't to call, like, every value bet or call a certain percentage of your value bets. Is to call the right kind of value bets, such that you skew his range in the direction that you want it to end up in. And in this instance, that's going to mean, if we have the 9 high flush with a 6, we're calling. And if we have my hand with higher absolute strength, but significantly worse removal effects, then we're just going to pitch it. And we get to fold a little bit more in this hand than in the sim, just because the risk reward is worse. And the price I'm getting on the check raise is also worse. Go with the call here. This is getting to be a little bit thin. It's worth... I mean, I potentially am trying to get involved a little bit with Leteski, although, like, it's not like I'm isolating him heads up in position or anything, so that's going to have minimal weight on my decision-making. 7-7-6-4, I think I just fold, but 3-card 0 gap with a mid-pair seems just about good enough to get involved. Flop checks through, and we go with large bet on the turn. There are some good things about betting straight draws on two-tone textures in multi-way pots. Most specifically, that people are a lot more cautious about continuing non-nutted flush draws. So the idea of betting to kind of clean up your equity has some amount more merit multi-way. Obviously, it also has more risk because you're betting into a higher number of people, but those are the breaks. In terms of this specific combination, like blocking the 5 is nice, but blocking the 8 would be significantly better. You typically want turn interaction when you're making kind of a marginal turn bet. The 7-7 is a little bit nice, gives me some river playability. I can potentially turn my hand into a bluff on a 6. I can potentially value at a 7, given that the 9-6 and 6-4 straights aren't massively well represented in their ranges. This is definitely not going to be a thing in in Solverland. I'm not going to have any big bets here as a consequence of basically never having ace plus. So I don't have 4-3 to overcall the small blind, and I don't have aces to not squeeze the small blind. So my range is kind of capped, and as a result, I'm not going to start blasting away in the solver. But in practice, I find that this line works pretty well. And we get 2 folds. Full pot with strongish rainbow ace high hand on the button seems fine into TJ's big blind. I guess check back would be okay. You know, there's the whole like often playing passively with overcards thing, or like strong pair outs or whatever you would call them. I think c-bet's pretty good on this board though, because the EV of checking is quite low when I can't turn a backdoor flush draw. TJ's 3-betting more, king X than, 8X. So I probably have a little bit more king X than he does. I certainly have more of the strong pocket pairs. Yeah, so I can't really defend against probes on many turns because I never turn a flush draw, and a lot of my pairs are kind of mediocre. But I do block a lot of his defends with these cards. Like, I'd imagine he's at least sometimes just going to fold a hand like pocket 8s on this texture, so his V-pits are pretty Broadway oriented, and when I block 3 Broadway cards, that's going to mean that betting is going to struggle to do too badly. We go with small bet and get peeled. Pretty clear give up on the turn, I think. We typically want our bluffs to have more turn interaction and or blockers to the top of his range, and our hand kind of has neither. In fact, we block some of his weaker peels that might now fold. So check back seems good. And he goes with full pot on the river, which is kind of an interesting bet sizing choice. This is probably going to be a thing in Solverland. Like, you often see large bets used when the in-position player checks back and the turn is kind of a brick. The checks back turn on the river is kind of a brick. So I'm sure this is fine theoretically, but it's important to note that if you have this river bet size, then you need to have the light flop floats that form its bluffing region. And on a board where there are no open-enders and just gut shots that I block, well, the fact that I block them is irrelevant, but the fact that there are only gut shots and then one inside wrap, like, TJ doesn't have a ton of low equity continues on flop. And it could be that he struggles to find enough bluffs on river for this bet size. It could definitely be that if you slightly overfold flop, you don't want to have this river bet size because then you're just way too value heavy. And you end up having to size down on river as a result of not defending the hands on the flop that make up the bluffing region of a large river bet size. if that sentence makes sense. So this is fine. My hand is obviously a fold, but it's worth noting that this bet size, if it's made with a balanced range, suggests that he's finding some relatively light peels on flop in a situation where some people could kind of err on the side of caution. Pretty easy over limp, and now I think with the deuce 4 combination we just fold. Raise and take the blinds. So yeah, I think this is going to be a pretty standard cold call. You obviously don't see much cold calling going on small blind versus under the gun in general, but as I've said a few times now, there's a lot more VPing going on out of the small blind in zero rake MTT environments versus sub 3x RFI sizings. So my hand's too disconnected to 3-bet, but it's, I would say, by a distance too strong to be folding versus 2.7x. And also by calling, like if the EV of calling and 3-betting were hypothetically kind of close, then I may err on the side of calling to get into a 3-way pot against Benvas, who you may recall from the previous MTT hand history review series I did, although most of the benefit of that would accrue to Espen in the under the gun seat. We go with called pot codes heads up and face roughly half pot c-bet. So this is where it starts to matter quite a lot that the ranges in play give me a severe shortage of high equity hands. Like if this were, again, big blind versus button, I just have a ton of top 2+ to be check raising. I don't really have those hands in the small blind in this situation. Like I don't really interact well with 5-3 deuce flush draw at all, apart from the odd, ace king jack 4 kind of thing. But if working with solvers teaches you something, it's that you don't react to a shortage of nut combinations, even at low SPR, or even at high SPR, unless you're at an extreme polarity disadvantage. You don't react by just abandoning aggression. And so, like, as for example, in a video series I did a while ago called Low Boards is the Out Position 3-better, we were looking at some boards where at the out position player had a shortage of high equity hands to be check raising. And what typically happened was he just dug further and further down in his range to find those combinations and keep his check raise frequency up around a certain level. And that's kind of a roundabout way of saying that I think this hand is a super easy check call if I somehow had it big blind versus button. And I still kind of prefer check call with this particular combination here. But check raise becomes a lot more worth considering because the EV of check call is not that high. Like I check call, the turn is the 10 of diamonds. I check, he bets 2/3 pot. And he'll barrel turn quite aggressively because I don't have that much high equity stuff going on. So the absence of a backdoor flush draw makes it so I get barreled off my equity at a higher frequency, semi-worthless pair outs, kind of the same thing. So check raise is worth considering here, but yeah, check call is I guess the standard. I guess I'll have the odd like 8-7, 6-5, or like I said, I'll find ways to have ace-4 combinations. I can have the odd double pair that I opted not to 3-bet, that kind of thing. So call seems reasonable, but it is worth keeping in mind the more general principle of not reacting to a shortage of high equity hands by just going into your shell because your opponent will just run you over all the more. You just need to work harder to find your check raises in that situation, even if they're kind of not ideal combinations. Well, it's not an ideal board texture for you, so you don't get to have the ideal combinations every single time. We do go with call, and this is one of the turns that I was kind of like one of the many turns I was kind of talking about. Like I check he bets any reasonable sizing here, I'd probably just have to fold. Fortunately, it checks through, and I don't think that now I have very much unpaired stuff at all. Like the jack is a card I interact with at some frequency because I can just have ace jack 9-7. So I lose some number of hands like flop flush draws that may have needed to bluff on other runouts. And then when I call here, I have a lot of like, kings with hearts, queens with hearts, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I think I just struggle to find unpaired hands to the point where I'm just mostly bluffing the vast majority of them when they do pop up in my range. And seems like just smallish sizing. Like most of the hands I'm representing for value is like ace, king, king, ace, queen, queen, that kind of thing. So pretty small. Like I guess I can have some ace 4 that I check called flop and some 3x and stuff, but I think small works best for my range overall. We go with kind of block, and also I don't have an ideal bluffing hand is the other thing. Like if I had 2 sizings or whatever, then flop flush draw combinations probably are a little bit more inclined to go in the small sizing because they don't make fantastic bluffs. Yeah, I have not fantastic removal with this combination, but kind of no choice but to give it a shot. And fortunately, we get it through. And that successful note seems like a reasonable point to wrap up this part. Hopefully, everyone's enjoying the series so far. Any questions, comments, feedback of other kinds well received in the thread below or elsewhere. And until next time, it's been Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. Take care.